Hello and welcome to The Defender, Wisconsin's environmental podcast. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. The Defender is powered by Clean Wisconsin, your environmental voice since 1970. When I tell you the topic of this episode, you're probably going to think it's depressing or maybe even scary. But I promise there is reason for optimism. Researchers at the University of Minnesota have been testing our rain and snow in the upper Midwest to see if it contains PFAS. Those are the toxic forever chemicals that are still being manufactured by chemical companies and used in all kinds of consumer products, from air fryers and burger wrappers to couches and carpets. Because the chemicals don't break down in the environment, they've been making their way into our lakes, rivers, streams, drinking water, fertilizer, soil, and yes, even in our air. But how much PFAS is really flying around up in the sky? In this episode, what the rain and snow are telling us about PFAS pollution, plus some information about new PFAS laws in Minnesota that could be a blueprint for Wisconsin. That's right now on The Defender. For 2 years, researchers at the University of Minnesota have been collecting rain and snow samples in the upper Midwest to figure out how much PFAS is falling from the skies. Joining me is Alex Frie, Research and Fellowship Coordinator with Minnesota Sea Grant, who led the project. Alex, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Amy, and to Clean Wisconsin for having me.
First, I think when they do think about PFAS, and they may not always think about it, they might think about drinking water because there's been a lot of attention at PFAS found in our drinking water and standards and filtration and things like that. What made you want to look at PFAS in our atmosphere and in the rain?
Yeah, it's a great question because you're right. Normally, we think about PFAS contamination at like a single site, discharge of PFAS contamination area. But there's actually quite a bit of evidence for PFAS contamination in really remote regions too. A lot lower levels than right next to a prime source. But there's evidence for PFAS contamination in the Antarctic, in the North Pole, South Pole, in really remote lakes. And really, the only way that can happen is through atmospheric transport, in that PFAS then depositing out of the atmosphere. So we know that this is happening. We don't always know the magnitude or how important it is. So it's really important for us to look at it and understand, how that PFAS is getting in the atmosphere, and importantly, how much is coming out and entering, our ecosystems.
We talk a lot about PFAS, the impact on your health, or finding it in the atmosphere or finding it in the water, but we don't always talk about, it almost feels like it got there by magic, right? We don't always talk about, hey, where's this? Why is this here? Where's it coming from? We just talk about kind of like the end, like when it encounters us. So where in your mind is, or are all these sort of, I guess, very small particles of PFAS coming from?
Yeah. So, and I think particles and gases, right? So some PFAS are actually volatile, so they can actually evaporate. So especially when we think about some of the PFAS that are getting more attention now, that are shorter chain species, those have potential to potentially evaporate into the atmosphere as well. And it's kind of a mixed bag as to where it's coming from. There's a lot of uncertainty in this space, but definitely, manufacturers are kind of point source emitters. So if someone is producing PFAS compounds or they're using them in a manufacturing process, there's potential for that to end up in the atmosphere. They might be spraying PFAS on a metal plating thing. So you can imagine, as you aerosolize it, it would then end up in the atmosphere. And if you're producing PFAS at scale, you may be emitting quantities of these PFAS compounds into the atmosphere as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, for some species. There is also a trend. So we know that kind of legacy PFAS that have the most well-established toxicity, we're thinking like PFOS, PFOA, really a lot of regulatory scrutiny. Those have more or less been phased out. But there's species that have come to replace them that are more likely to kind of go into the atmosphere. They're more likely to be a little more volatile. And there's kind of a phenomenon where we consider many of them precursors to these species that are more kind of long-lived and what we call kind of terminal or legacy PFAS. So they go into the atmosphere, they can do a little bit of chemistry, and they turn into things varying chain lengths. So PFAS chain lengths really matter. So but things like PFOA or PFOS. So there's like a phenomenon in environmental chemistry called regrettable substitution, and some of this could be explained by that, where we've replaced some of these traditional PFAS with shorter, different chemical compositions, but they're still PFAS, that are more likely to go in the atmosphere, more likely to transport in the atmosphere, as we moved away from the things that we know to be toxic. Because generally we think of kind of PFOA and PFOS being a little bit less volatile, a little bit less atmospheric present, but we still do see them in like the rain and snow as well.
So I want to take a minute to kind of explain some of the sciencey stuff that you're talking about. You're using
Yep.
this term
Sorry.
species. Probably a lot of people don't realize that PFAS is like it's like a big class of chemicals, and so there are thousands. I don't think anybody really knows exactly how many types have been produced over the decades. And I guess they started out, back in the 40s with these what you might call long chain PFAS. So that means the molecules longer. The PFOA and the PFOS, those ones that are well studied and are very toxic at potentially very low levels. And then when that started to be like, hey, those stay in your body for a while because they are the longer chain and they're kind of hurting people. The chemical industry was like, well, we'll make some smaller ones, right? Is that what happened? They're like, we'll make some shorter chain ones and they won't stay in your body as long. Is that kind of where we're at right now?
I, I think that's an okay summary. I think that's more or less, and I think whether or not that means that we get more exposure or not is kind of up for
Yeah.
question. Like those potential species are potentially less toxic, even if they're maybe more mobile as well. So the jury's still out a little bit about the product of that change, but one of the products is that many of those species are more mobile in the environment, and so we see them more places, I guess. So.
Right. So those kind of smaller ones, I think they're generally less studied because they're newer. And the thought is, well, they won't stay in your body as much, but then at the same time, we're sort of exposed to them in all kinds of places now. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, I think that would be correct to say. And I would say that we also have this interesting phenomenon that's happening now over the past decade or so, where, like you said, there's thousands of PFAS where we used to think about, these traditional PFAS like PFOA, PFOS that are, just, head group in a long fluorinated chain. I know that's really in the chemistry, but now the definition of PFAS, like, the definition that Minnesota has adopted with its new Amara's law definition, that have been adopted in multiple kind of like NGO spaces, is like one fully fluorinated carbon, which is again very technical, but means that all these other things that that are pesticides, that are potentially pharmaceuticals, we would now count as PFAS as well, too. So there's kind of an interesting effect that we now are counting more things as PFAS too, and some of those we potentially see in the atmosphere. So that's a bit of a tangent there, but I think important to add here. That's not what we're focusing on here, but when we talk about kind of PFAS in the atmosphere, we do see a lot of these, what I would call non-traditional PFAS that we now are thinking of in the PFAS space and now are regulating in the PFAS space as well.
So when things get in the atmosphere, PFAS or other things, they have a tendency to fall down to the earth in rain. Did your study kind of look at the rain and what's happening with that?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what we focused on. So we worked with the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, which was established kind of in response to the acid rain kind of crises in the 80s and 90s, to monitor originally to monitor nutrients and kind of acidity in the rain. They're actually based out of the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene right now. And they have a precipitation monitoring program and have added PFAS into what they can do. So we worked with them to add PFAS to two sites in Minnesota and Michigan, and monitor the kind of PFAS composition over in the rain and snow on a weekly basis. So kind of essentially it's just a bucket that opens and closes when it rains. And then we say, well, there's a person that goes to that bucket, takes that sample and mails it off to a lab once a week. And so we get this nice continuous data set of PFAS that is really novel. There's been a few of these that are coming out in the past few years, but to have a data set in multiple sites, continuous, really shows us that there is kind of this, when we look at that data, there is, PFAS there in the rain and snow, and it's persistent. In the 100 some samples we would typically get over 2 years, 70 to 100 samples, depending on how much it rains over those 2 years. We didn't have a single sample that didn't have some detectable level of PFAS. And one other thing that's important to note here is the analytical methods are quite good now. So we can detect very, very, very low levels of PFAS, but the contamination is prevalent and essentially ubiquitous. Every rain and snow sample that we sampled did have some level of PFAS in it.
I mean, how did that, I guess, make you feel? Because, when you're a kid and you're out in the snow and it's falling, you're like, oh, this is clean. You eat it or whatever, or make a snow cone out of it. Or, you think of what falls from the sky as being pure. And I know you're a scientist and you probably don't think that way anymore. But when you didn't get one sample without at least a trace or ultra trace amount of PFAS chemical in it, what went through your mind?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that, that the idea that we think of the atmosphere as pure is something that is worth like examining. And I do kind of remember when I was, in graduate school, as a person that, did a lot of atmospheric science, like coming to the realization that, there's chemistry going on in the atmosphere. Lots of the things that we use in a day-to-day life, they do not stay, in a liquid, in a solid. Many of them evaporate and they go up and they come back down. And so I think there's kind of a change in mindset there that is, many of us should think about is the atmosphere is a contaminatable space, that many of these organic chemicals that we use, they go into the atmosphere and they're there. As far as like this specific data set, when thinking about the contamination levels, um, it wasn't too surprising, given that what we know about how prevalent PFAS are, as well as how good the analytical methods are, that um, we have become really good over the past 2 decades at finding PFAS. And so it can mean like it's a needle in a haystack and we can detect it. So that's anytime we talk about PFAS kind of contamination, I think that's important to keep in mind. Um, those lowest level of concentrations of samples that we found PFAS in, likely it doesn't have a lot of environmental impact or human impact there. But it's still important to kind of understand, how we understand the prevalence of PFAS contamination. So yeah, surprised, but like understandable within the realm of how good the analytical chemistry is.
So PFAS are famously known as forever chemicals, right? Because the chemistry of the molecule makes it very, very, very difficult to break down. Um, so as you're measuring these chemicals in our atmosphere, in our rain, and in our snow, knowing that we're still manufacturing these chemicals all over the place, and they're used, they're probably in the cushion of the chair I'm sitting on right now. They're probably in my shoes. Certainly in my water resistant jackets. Um, does it feel like, hey, maybe people should, not just people, but maybe lawmakers should start paying attention, and chemical manufacturers, that these chemicals that we're putting in the atmosphere, they're going to be with us for easily thousands of years.
Yeah, and yes, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's very important to think about, contamination in a holistic sense that, when we do use these things for, what are really useful purposes, like your raincoat, like my raincoat almost has PFAS, likely has PFAS in it too, that those things end up in the environment and they will, exist, especially when we talk about these like as forever chemicals, they will exist in the environment and they will have potentially negative effects for a very long period of time. So it's really important to think about that when we think about what we're using when in our products. So yes, yes, it's important that we think about where PFAS go. And I will say that for our samples, we do see some concentrations actually in rain and snow that are above the Minnesota kind of health-based guidance for PFOA specifically. And that health-based guidance is some of the lowest in the country. So whether or not that will stay at that level, but if that, is a value that bears out, having toxic effects at that low level, it could potentially mean that, you have, PFAS contamination that's relevant to human health actually in the rain and snow. And so that's a potentially interesting and impactful finding. And so if that's true, then we potentially want to regulate that to address that as well.
So is it then not an exaggeration to say that we are surrounding ourselves with PFAS? Because if it's in the atmosphere, it's in the rain, it's in the snow, it's in our clothes, it's in our pots and pans, it's in our couches, and in our drinking water to some extent, because it's extremely difficult to get it all out. Um, are we getting PFAS from almost every different source, our when we breathe, when we eat, when we drink.
Yeah, it's not a stretch to say PFAS contamination is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It is, like I said earlier, you find it in the Antarctic. You find it, I think if you have a big enough sample and the right instrument, you will find PFAS in almost every environment, every living being kind of on the planet. Um, that is not an exaggeration. I think whether or not it matters for like a health or environmental um, impact context is another question. But yes, we all have PFAS in us. You can mitigate some of your own exposure, through like avoiding use of some PFAS containing products or potentially regulating them out. But right now, there is PFAS. It's in the rain, it's in most in waters, it's in most soils at some level. So, yep, that is a correct statement that it's pretty much everywhere. So,
I think there's probably two ways people are kind of taking in this information right now. One is, oh my gosh, I'm horrified. How can I protect myself? And the other is kind of like, well, I guess I can't worry about that. It's over, kind of thing. It's too late to do anything about it if it's in my air and it's in my water. What's your, I guess, reaction to that kind of overwhelmed feeling that people have that when they read your study and think, well, okay, there's PFAS in my rain. I guess, I'll just look the other way because it's too awful to think about. How can you kind of help people through that?
yeah, no, that's a great question. I'd say that, we have to think about the agency we have. I think both of those answers are the wrong answer. The like we should panic and like we're all going to die, or we can't do anything because the problem's too big. Neither of those are the right answer, because there are spots that like where the impact is the greatest and we can mitigate that, right? There are if a state or a government chooses, there's regulatory options. So in Minnesota, we do see Amara's law is they're removing PFAS from a lot, if not all, of consumer products, um, and there's a lot of phase outs of a lot of the specific PFAS there. So there are solutions that are being done. There's also, there's mitigation in place. The places where PFAS has the most impact, are those places where there's kind of that localized high level contamination. That is where you'll see kind of the most acute impact. So that's where, we should be worried. Should we be concerned about PFAS kind of in the everywhere? We should be concerned about it, but should we panic about it? Maybe not. But we should probably work to resolve it and try to think about, is this the world we want to see, or is this the world we want to, use our agency to kind of change, right? It's within our control to some level. And I know a lot of the PFAS is a big problem, but this kind of prevalent contamination doesn't mean like the world is over either. Does that help? Is that clear?
I mean, I think.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
I'll ask you more about what we can do in a minute, but I did want to get back because, you're over there in Minnesota. I'm here in Wisconsin, and we're next door neighbors, but in the PFAS landscape, I think things are very different. You've got 3M there, and I think you're mentioning some laws that I don't really even know about that Minnesota has to try to get a handle on PFAS contamination that certainly Wisconsin does not have. So explain to me again, what is this law that you're referring to, or what are the steps that Minnesota has taken to try to do some actual work to get PFAS out of our lives?
Yeah. I'll preface this by saying I'm not a legal expert in this, but I'm like loosely aware. So the
Right.
law is called Amara's law. I believe it was passed 2 years ago. And the point is to phase out PFAS in Minnesota, essentially, for kind of non-avoidable uses. So looking at consumer products that have PFAS and saying, you really need to be using something else, especially in spaces like where kids are involved. Like there's a lot of focus on like child-facing products and really trying to have a plan for phasing PFAS out in kind of most products in Minnesota. So that is like an effort that's being led by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's ongoing, but it potentially has a lot of impact on kind of the exposure. So I do also think like 3M has some phase out plans for the PFAS like in the manufacturing plants in Minnesota. So one nice thing that we hope to see through our work is if those 3M plants are important to atmospheric the PFAS that we're seeing in the atmosphere in our Minnesota sites. We have kind of future work planned that in the next few years that maybe we'll see less, showing the impact of those phase outs as well. Because we're not sure at this point, how important those different sources are. We hope to be as we move forward and kind of hope to, build some arguments around there. But yeah, so Amara's law is the law in Minnesota. It kind of classifies, PFAS as a class, and that has that kind of broad. Like an interesting aspect of how Amara's law is it has a really broad definition of PFAS. So again, there's, pesticides that potentially fall under it as well. And like what that will look like is an interesting, discussion. But it's really ongoing, and hopefully in the next few years we'll see a more or less complete phase out of PFAS in Minnesota. And you may want to fact check me on that because I'm 80% sure that's accurate. So,
Yeah. Well, I know, yes, you're not a policy expert on
yeah.
all the intricacies of that law, but I do think it's important for people in Wisconsin to kind of hear
Hmm.
what neighboring states are doing. And I know there's a lot happening also in Michigan. So our
Yeah, you're
two
right.
neighbors.
Yeah.
It feels like we are, as a world and certainly as a nation, producing more PFAS, not less. I went to buy some, like a bedspread the other day, and it was labeled water resistant. And I'm going, well, this is a grown up bedspread. It's not for a crib. Why are you making this resistant? I feel like PFAS is in almost everything. So, what, I guess, goes through your mind, or when you see, on one hand, people are like very upset about chemicals and PFAS in our environment. And on the other hand, everywhere you look, something new is coming out with PFAS in it. Is it kind of frustrating?
I guess I think of myself as a pragmatist a little bit. I'd say frustrating was not as a person who is like trained as an environmental chemist, you see chemicals everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you start to understand that everything we use, every single piece of clothing, every single product has something in it that is a chemical there too. So I'd say frustrating is not the right word. I think because we know that some of these things are toxic, hopefully we're seeing those phased out. PFAS are really useful, right? That's why we see them in the products that we do see. Um, I do think we're moving towards, consumer product phase outs. We see them in lots of different states are requiring them now. So like your exposure as an individual, my exposure as an individual, I think I'm optimistic that we'll see reductions over the next few decades. I think like that's the trajectory. There's enough public concern, and I'd say almost bipartisan concern around PFAS. There are still work, there's work being done to kind of reduce PFAS exposures. I'm optimistic over the long term that some of those things that you maybe think of are, or that we can maybe think of as maybe unnecessary uses of PFAS are going to be less common in the next decade or two. So I'm optimistic there.
This is the most optimistic conversation I have ever had on PFAS. So I really appreciate your optimism.
Yeah. Well, I'm an optimist in general, I think. So hopefully it's well placed.
Yeah. Especially, I think, when you're close to something, when you're research, we're in the Great Lakes region, largest freshwater system in the world is here. We have a lot to protect. To kind of see some warning signs of danger, can be frightening,
Yeah.
but
And
hopefully
that
it's
does bring
research
up
like you. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that does bring up a good point. So I think back to where your question of why are we doing this? Like Minnesota Sea Grant specifically, like we focus on like Great Lakes issues. And like, when we think about water in the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Superior, a lot of that water comes in through the atmosphere. Over half of the water into Lake Superior comes in as rain. So that happens over the lake before it doesn't hit ground before it ends up in the lake. So when we think about contamination to our large lakes, the composition of the atmosphere, the composition and the rain and snow really matters, and that is one of our kind of major motivations as well to understand the contamination to those large lakes that's coming through the atmosphere. Um,
And I've been fortunate enough to see a beautiful rainstorm over Lake Superior. I know exactly what you're saying. I think people in Wisconsin, we love our Great Lakes. We don't always think about them necessarily, and how to protect them or how unique and special they are. So, is there any, you've come out with this research, you're going to be presenting it. What are, I guess, the next steps after that?
Yeah, for us, we're going to kind of continue. So our research really has kind of three prongs. The first is kind of this traditional analysis of looking at what we would call, high confidence traditional PFAS. We're also doing some more exploratory work to understand, that those thousands of compounds that we know exist, to see maybe at a little bit lower confidence, use some nice analytical chemistry tools to explore which ones are in rain and snow and maybe which ones aren't in our current methods we should explain. And we're also doing kind of atmospheric modeling as well. So looking backwards to figure out, if we see this in the rain and snow at a given place, can we look at where those air masses come from? So, looking at the history, just like you think a forecast, but it's backwards. It's a backwards forecast. And so we can do that for when we see these chemicals in this bucket. And if we sample there for a long time, we can start to say something about where those chemicals are coming from, hopefully. And we're actually excited to say, this summer we're starting another 3-year project, really focused on Minnesota. So the project we're just finishing up is focused kind of on the whole region. But over the next 3 years, we'll have 7 different sites across Minnesota that we're going to sample PFAS in. So hopefully we'll see this. So if we have like phase outs from Mara's Law, we have phase outs that are happening at 3M plants, that will see, reductions in chemical and PFAS pollution in the rain and snow in Minnesota and potentially cleaner waters in Minnesota over the next 3 years. So that's one thing we're hoping.
Well, that's wonderful. And you have, it's a first to make me feel optimistic about PFAS. So I really appreciate it. Alexander Frie, researcher with the University of Minnesota, thank you so much for being here and explaining a really complicated but important topic. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, for having me.
And thank you for listening to The Defender. For more information on Amara's Law in Minnesota, that's the law that targets PFAS in consumer products, check out the show notes or log on to cleanwisconsin.org. Plus, we have plenty of links to a lot more information on the health harms and costs of PFAS and plenty of previous episodes linked on this critical topic. Again, just check the show notes. And if you have something you want me to talk about or a comment on the show, send me an email, podcast@cleanwisconsin.org. Remember to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast streaming platform because it helps other people find us. I also want to give a shout out to our new listeners on Civic Radio, news, and talk stations across the state. Welcome to the conversation. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. Talk to you later.